All right. So today we'll talk about mocking to cover our button test. Now, we want our test to run quickly because ideally we run our test every time we make code changes before we push it up to the repo. And so if we start to develop lots of tests, we have an application that gets big and we have, 50, 100 tests running or something, we don't want it to take 5 hours to run our tests because that would suck. So we have an interest in making our tests run quickly. And we also don't want our tests to test all this peripheral stuff necessarily. So we want a way to kind of mock the testing of some things, or to kind of substitute something else in that just returns what we need to test our code. And then also mocking gives us a way to isolate our testing, so we make sure that we're only testing this particular piece of code that we're trying to assert with this test. So we can mock functions or modules to reduce or remove side effects, but we can also use mocks to spy on function calls to test that actions are performed. So that's two different ways of using mocking, and we'll cover both of those today with a simple example for our bookmark component. So I just mentioned all of this, I think. So we reduce side effects by giving us a way to test only your code without testing and calling third-party code. It can also make setup and teardown of tests easier. So, for example, our bookmark button is a delete button, and if we fully implement that delete, then it's going to actually delete the bookmark in our database. And we don't necessarily want to test that every time we test the bookmark component, right? We would test that that works as a separate test to test the function of that particular remove function, but we don't want to test it as a part of testing our bookmark component. So that is another reason that we use mocks. Preventing expensive calls to remote APIs and servers. So that's about getting the time for testing down, because we don't want it to take a long time to run all of our tests. And we also might want to avoid calls that would return differently in our development environment than they would in production. So that's another reason we might use mocking. And then we can also use mocks to spy on functions that are called by actions in our components to make sure they're being called properly. So they're called with the correct arguments, for example, and they're called the correct number of times. So first we're going to look at using mocking to spy on functions, because this in some ways is simpler to understand. We can use this jest.fn to create a spy for a function. Basically, it creates like a mock function, and we can define that function inside of these parentheses, which you'll see that I'll do. And so we can just create a dummy function that takes the input that we expect our function to take, maybe just prints out a message that says we got the input. It doesn't have to do much. And then when we've created that spy function, this mock function, then we can run assertions against it to see that it got called. So really using the spy function just gives us a way to see that the events in our component result in calling a function with the correct arguments the correct number of times. Okay, that's how we use that. So we use enzyme to do this, to actually render our component in the JS DOM with the event in that rendering, and then we can access that particular element of our component that has the event defined on it, and we can make that event fire. Okay? And so we can either use shallow or mount, which are both methods in enzyme, to do this rendering of our component with the event in it. And then we can query what gets returned, which is a representation of the DOM that gets rendered, or what gets rendered to the DOM. We can use what gets returned to look at it, to manipulate it, and to assert what happens when we act on it. So shallow and mount are two different things that we can do. Shallow will render the top level component only. Now in the case of our bookmark, we only have a top level component. It doesn't have children with their own events and things like that, okay? So it's a simple case. It won't make any difference if we use shallow or mount in the case of our bookmark component. But some components may have nested components in them, right? And those nested components may have events on them. They may have be wrapped up in component life cycles. So we use shallow when we just want to test the top level component and we want to isolate testing to that top level component. We use a mount when we want to test the children components or components that interact with the DOM APIs or might require the full life cycle to fully test the component, like if you want to test component did mount, for example. So today we're going to use shallow, but we could use either one in this sort of case that we're looking at today. All right, so let's look at this first, and then we'll talk about the rest of this presentation. So let's just start to see it so it starts to make a bit more sense rather than just talking about it. So if we look at the code and we look at our bookmark test, right now all we're doing is a snapshot test. So this is just going to test that the component renders the way we expect it to, and we talked about that last time. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add a test, and we can just add another one here, and we're going to say, we'll say that it should call remove with the correct argument. That's what we're going to test with this test. Now, in order to do this, I mentioned that we're going to have to use shallow from enzyme. So we're going to have to import shallow from enzyme, which of course means we need to install enzyme. There's one more piece of this, and that is we're using, so let's install enzyme. You'll see we're using enzyme 3.x, and that requires one more piece of work that I'll talk about in a minute. So if you do a yarn add enzyme, then if we look in our package.json, you can see it added enzyme at version 3. And when you use enzyme version 3, you have to define an adapter. And you could do that in each test file, or you could do that in a setup file that Jest recognizes, so you only have to do it once, and then anywhere you use shallow or mount to render your components for testing, the adapter will be set up. So to do that, we're going to add a file just in the source directory called setuptest.js. And if we tried to run our test without doing this, we'd get an error. We can do that if you want, so you can see the error. Do you want to do that first to see what error we get if we don't have setup test defined? Let's do that. So just leave that file there for the moment. We'll go back to our bookmark test because it'll tell you. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we'll define the ID that we're going to pass into our delete. So this is our bookmark ID. And then we're going to define a spy or a stub. So let's call it remove stub. And we're going to define it as jest.fn. And so inside of jest.fn, we're just going to define our function. So it's going to be passed an ID. We expect that this function that gets called when we click the delete button gets passed an ID of the bookmark. And all we're going to tell it to do, because this is just a mock function, okay, I'm going to print something so we can see we're actually in it. So, and I'm going to use backtick so I can refer to the ID. So I'm going to say in remove stub mock function with ID. Okay. And that's all I'm going to do in here. So again, it doesn't matter what this function does. It could do nothing at all if you want. But I'm just adding this so that we can see that it gets called. So now what we're going to do is we're going to use shallow. So I'm going to just create a variable called wrapper. And it's going to take what gets returned by shallow. And in shallow, we're going to do similar to like we do in our snapshot test. We're going to tell it what to render, and we're going to point to our bookmark component, so it renders our bookmark component. And we're going to pass in our ID. So that's the ID that we defined right at the top of that function. And we will also pass in a title and a URL. So we'll say title equals my bookmark and URL equals HTTP. And it doesn't matter what we put here, remember, we're just putting some information that fits what we would expect to see. And then we're also going to pass remove. So I'm just going to show you what our bookmark looks like right now. It takes in remove as a prop, and that's a function, right? That's a function. And then we use that function in our button on click. So guess what we're going to pass in for the remove function? That's right. So basically, we're just calling this just like our app does, right? Just like our bookmark list does in this case, but we're passing it the stub for the function so that it calls that. And then once we've done that, then we can use the wrapper to find the button component. So we do that by saying, we can say let button equal wrapper dot find button. So this tells, what we're saying here is I want you to find the element, the button element. And if you have more than one button element, you'd have to do some more here. We only have one button element. I think there's a find first and that sort of thing. Or you could search for, you can find it by class, you can find it by label, you can find it by lots of things. But since we only have,
do you have to specify that, like in the find?
Yeah, I think there's a find by label, find by text. There's some different different methods that we could call there. So we're just going to say find button, and we can do some checking here to make sure that we actually have our button, so we have some confidence about that, just to also show you some of the other things that we can do. So for example, we can say that button dot text to equal, and in this case it's delete, I'm pretty sure, with an exclamation point. Let's just check that. Nope, no exclamation point. So to equal delete, so we expect that, and that will give us, that'll let us know that we found the right button. So if that assertion doesn't pass, so there's something else wrong here. And then we can do one of two things. Now we want to click the button. Okay, so we have the button here in this button variable. We actually have a handle on the button itself. So we could say button.simulate click, and simulate comes with enzyme, but we don't have to actually pull it in. So we could say button simulate click. That's one way we can do it. Another way that we could do it is we could say, I'm just going to show you here and then I'll remove it, button.prop, and the property on the button that we care about is on click. And then we can call that on click. So that's the second way. Now the first way, using simulate, goes through sort of this event framework to simulate the button click. Now I would say that's sort of inviting some extra trouble potentially if there's something that goes wrong with the enzyme implementation. And I'll tell you it happens because when I was working on this lesson, there were a lot of complaints about things not being compatible between versions of enzyme. They do a pretty good job of keeping it good and robust and compatible between versions, but there could be a problem. So you could just avoid that and just click the button directly, because remember, when we're clicking this button, all we're doing right now is calling our mock function. We're not actually going to do anything destructive when we click this button in this case, because we've passed in a mock function. So we could just say, I would choose to do button.prop in this case. And if you go read the stuff that's out there, you'll see a lot of people suggesting, unless you have a good reason to use simulate, you should just get the on-click property and just use it directly. That's a better practice. Okay, so we're going to do that one. And when we click that button, we can say that we expect that our remove stub to be called with our particular argument, right? Which is ID. So this tells us, one, that the function was called, and two, that it was called with the argument that we expect. All right, so let's see what happens. Assuming I don't have any typos, let's just see. Now, I told you we didn't do the setup yet, so I actually expect this to fail, but let's see if it fails for the reason that I expect it to, and not because I did a typo. Okay, so I need to also do an install of React test renderer. That's interesting, because I thought I ran this already. Anyway, so if you haven't done this yet, yarn add React test renderer. Oh. Okay, so let's see what it says. So this is the error that I expected. So this says enzyme expects an adapter to be configured but found none. To configure an adapter, you should call enzyme configure adapter new adapter before using any of enzyme's top level APIs, where adapter is the adapter corresponding to the library currently being tested. In our case, we're testing React version 16, I think, or maybe it's 15. We can look at the package JSON. So it tells you what you have to add. Okay, so let's go add that now. So we're going to do it, as I mentioned, in setup test. Now we could do this in our test file, but then we'd have to do it in every test file where we use enzyme, shallow, or mount. So to avoid that, we're just going to add it here. And so the way we do it is in our setup.js, we say import configure from enzyme. So we have to import configure first. And we also have to import adapter from enzyme adapter, just like it mentioned in our error, React 15. See, it told me 15. I think we actually have React 16. Let's check. I think maybe that's just a general message. Let's look at our package JSON. I have React 16. You should have React 16 too. So we're actually going to refer to, React 16 because we have React 16 and not 15. That might be a generic message. I'm not sure. Maybe it just didn't recognize.
I wonder if is there a React?
There is a React 16
is there an
adapter.
For it? Yeah.
There is. We'll double check in a minute because we'll have to install it too. So once we have configure an adapter imported, then we can say configure adapter new adapter. I think those inner ones supposed to be curly, sorry. Okay, so let's try to install these. I'm going to save that file. And I still have npm test running. because it's in watch mode. So you can see that now it's failing because we don't have that adapter installed. So let's do that. So we'll do yarn add the adapter. Yep, so there is an adapter 16. So if we look in our package JSON now, we have that adapter installed. So let's try npm test now. Okay, cool. So let's notice, so I'll wait and see if you guys get to this point. So again, we run npm, notice that it's only running these two tests, and that's because by default, npm test runs only the test for files that changed since the last time you ran npm test. Okay? Now if I hit the A here to run all tests, then the next time it'll run all tests. So if I leave it in watch mode and I make a change to any file, it'll run all tests. So this npm test sort of like stores or remembers the last option you did. Remember when we were doing this the other day and I did some regex matching on the test name and on the file name, and then when it ran again, it only ran that one. So it does some remembering of the last watch option you use, but by default, when you just run npm test, it only runs tests for the last thing the things that have changed since the last time you ran test. Yes?
That adapter didn't quite work for me. I'm still getting the error that Enzyme expects an adapter to be.
Okay, so in your, first of all, I'll ask you, did you call your file setup_test.js just like this, and it's in the source directory? So setup
test.
Okay.
Plural, so.
Yep. So this is a convention that Jest uses, expecting this file to be called setup test. I think there's an alternative. You can have a __ test directory with a .setup in it or something like that. So you can look up those alternatives, but this is one convention that it recognizes as having this setup test named exactly this way in the source directory, and it'll find it.
That worked.
Okay, cool. Does everybody else have their test running that's trying? Yeah? So you can see, first of all, that our test passed, which means all those expect statements executed and passed that we put in, and it means that we executed that button click without it throwing an error. And you can see our console log here, right, that shows that we actually called our remove stub. We didn't call the real function, we called our remove stub, and we called it with the ID that we expected. So, say again?
How did you get there again?
npm test.
Yeah, sorry, I've got it. Sort of.
Okay, so does everybody see this? Okay.
No.
Yes.
How do you singular, like, mine get a label or look over my test with that table? How do you sort of
If you just want to isolate to run just this test, or just test for bookmark, what you can do is you can do P to filter by a file name is probably what I would do. So you just hit P when you're in watch mode, and then you can say bookmark. Now bookmark finds all of those, and I think it's because bookmark is mentioned in all of those. So maybe not P. Let's do
so
T.
You're not running coverage?
I'm not running coverage. Coverage is going to show everything, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do A for all. So now we have 8 tests. All right, is everybody okay with where we are now? Not yet? All right, so let's look at another kind of mocking. So that gave us some more test coverage, because now we know that when we click the button, it calls the function with the argument we expect, and that's good. But if we want to see that, so now though we're calling this mock function that we passed in, and if we want to see that it's calling the function that we expect it to call and not this mock function, so when it's called the function we expected to get called, that happens and that it gets past the right argument. So to do that, we're going to talk about a different kind of mocking, because we don't necessarily want to call our actual remove bookmark function, because that, if it's implemented correctly, is going to call the API on the server, and it's going to delete the bookmark, and it's going to change the state. Maybe that's appropriate, but maybe it's not. So I would suggest that you don't actually want to remove the bookmark when you test this functionality. So let's talk about mocking modules and functions. So one way to do this is that we can mock built-in NPM modules. So you might want to mock a built-in NPM module because you don't want to actually go execute the thing. You just want to assume that when you send input to this NPM module, that what happens is the expected thing and you get back what you expect. So you can write a mock for an NPM module and just make sure that it behaves the way that your code expects it to behave. And so what you would do is you would create a __ mocks directory at the top of your project directory or in the same directory as node modules, so in the same directory as node modules, and then you would add a file for any module you want to mock and you'd give it the same name. Okay? And then in that file, you would define any functions that you want to mock. All right? So for example, if you wanted to mock fetch, then you could mock fetch. Jest will automatically use mock functions that are defined this way for NPM modules. So you don't have to do anything to import it or to refer to it in your test. If you've got a mocked version of an NPM module in this particular directory, in that structure, anytime you run Jest, it's going to look in that directory to see if anything is mocked in NPM modules and use that instead of the actual function from NPM modules. Okay? So that's one thing that you can do. More likely, what you may want to do is to mock stuff from your own code. So in this case, we want to mock remove bookmark. We don't actually want to call the API and remove it. And so what you do in that case is you create a mocks subdirectory with __ before and after, but in the same directory as the module you're mocking. And you create a file with the same name as the module that you want to mock in that directory, and you add any functions to that file that you want to mock. Now, unlike with mocking node modules or stuff that comes with NPM, you have to tell your test that you want it to use a mocked function. So there's some stuff that you have to add to your test file to tell it to do that. I'll show you how to do that. Now, one thing, and I'll point this out again when we do the code along, when you are declaring this mocked function to be able to use it, when you import it or bring it into your test file, it's important that you use require instead of import. And that's because you have to use this Jest mock call and specify the module that you're mocking. Okay? And what that does is it tells Jest, I have some mocks for this module, go look for an __ mocks directory and find the mocked functions for this module. And then you have to actually import the function that you're going to call in your test that's mocked. But if you use import, the nature of JavaScript is that it'll hoist that import above the call to Jest mock. And so it'll define your function as the real one. Okay? So if you use require instead and put it after this call to Jest mock, then it won't hoist. So JavaScript won't hoist the require, and it'll read the mock first. It'll know to go look in this mock directory for functions first, and it'll pull your mocked function from the mock directory instead of using the real one. Okay, so I'll reiterate that when we do the code along, but that's something that's really important to understand. Okay, so before we do this, I'm going to show you what our bookmark looks like now, how remove gets called from the app, and we're going to do it a little bit differently. I'm just going to do a tiny bit of refactoring to kind of pull this remove bookmark function out into a service to make it easier to mock. Okay, so let's quickly, though, have a look at our test coverage now. Have you done this already? So we just added that test for bookmark. And that actually gets us 100% covered for bookmark, because now we're testing that click. So we could stop there, but we're going to go one step further just so I can demonstrate this other way to use mocking to you, and so we can actually check that remove bookmark function gets called correctly. So if we look at the way our code's structured right now, in bookmark we get passed in the remove function, and this gets passed in from bookmark list. In my implementation of the code, my bookmark list doesn't look like the one that Matt did yesterday. Okay, it's a little bit different. It's simpler. It's just a functional component, and all it does is render the list of bookmarks, and it gets that list of bookmarks from app.js, and it also gets the remove function from app.js. Okay, so in order to make it easier to mock this remove, I'm going to pull the remove out into another module that's just going to have that function in it. We could also put the fetch bookmarks in my module as well, which we could do, but I'm just going to call it, I'm going to use it like a service. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a file in a services directory, and this is just convention, okay? And I'm going to call it bookmark service.js. All right, and in this file, I'm basically going to take what's in app.js for remove, and I'm going to put it in my bookmark service. I'm in the right place, yeah. Now I'm going to have to import some things here.
Sorry, so we're making a new folder.
A new, yep, services.
That's outside of the source, or
It's inside a source, just inside the source directory, a directory called services, and then I created a file called bookmark service. And I'm actually not going to I just don't like calling it remove. I'm just going to call it remove bookmark, so that it's more, I don't know, I just like it better. So
that's inside the service.
this is in bookmark service.js. So I can see that I'm going to need to import store. And I had also abstracted out my actions. I'll show you that in a minute. So I have this set. And what else do I have here? Oh, I'm also going to add to this. I'm going to add something to this. I'm going to add a call to API, which I'll have to import. Delete. So I'm actually going to do the delete on the server, so I need to import. Right. All right, so I'm also going to add, just for our demonstration purposes, in the real remove bookmark with ID. Okay, so just like we were doing from app, we get the index, we get passed in the index for the bookmark we want to delete, and then we look for that bookmark from store get state, and so we get back the index from the Mongo database, that ID field from the Mongo database, and then we call our API delete to actually delete that from the database. And then we could do a little bit could do, make this a little bit cleaner. Oh, don't know how that happened. We could say, or we could do it like this. Might be nicer. Just so I only have to make that call to store once. That makes a lot more sense. So everybody see what I did there? I did it without talking. But in the code that I had there from app, I was calling store to get the bookmarks twice. The first time to find the the ID in the Mongo database for the bookmark, and the second time to update the state. So I could just refactor that a little bit so that I only call out to store once, which makes sense, okay? So I just save bookmarks there, and then I use that to find the one with the ID, and then if I find it, then I delete it, and I remove it, and then I update the state. Okay. Is everybody there? Okay, so now I need to use this instead of passing in remove from app.js. So I'll take care of app.js in a minute, but in bookmark list, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to import remove bookmark from services bookmark service, and instead of pulling it from props, I'm just going to pass it in here. Does that make sense? Is everybody following that? So instead of having it pass through props from app.js, I'm just going to pull it from the service in bookmark list. Now I'll clean up my app.js. To 51.
Did we have to export bookmark service?
Yes. Actually, no, we don't have to export bookmark service, but what we're going to export is the function. So yes, thank you. And we would have realized that pretty quickly, that that was a problem. Thank you for saving us from that. So now I just don't have to pass this in to my bookmark list anymore from app. So now from app, I just pass the bookmarks. Now we could do further refactoring here like Matt did yesterday. We could have bookmark list be the container element for our bookmark display component, right? And we could not pass anything at all from app.js, just let bookmark list handle fetching the bookmarks and everything else. I won't do that right now just in the interest of time because this is where I started from when I developed this lesson. But know that we could do that. Okay, so I'm going to save this. And then let's just see that I haven't broken anything.
Are they like, so we're just extracting all of the functions out of the state of the...
Yeah, so functions that that are kind of just performing a service. So in this case, you know, we're calling the server and we're updating the state. It could be if we, you know, in some applications that we might want to do that for multiple places. That could be a reason to pull it out. But it also makes it really easy to mock for testing. So that's my motivation for doing it in this case.
Keep it for the testing, but then you'd also just keep it as it is.
Yeah, just keep it. Yeah. So it's you know, it's a nice, for me, it's a nice way to have the code refactored, to have this separated out. And like I said, I would also add a fetch bookmarks here. So any services related to dealing with a bookmark, where I've got to go to the server, I've got to update the state, I would define in bookmark services, and then I can make use of that for my bookmark list container element if I want to. So it's just kind of a further abstraction of the code. And always when we're refactoring code this way, we have two things in mind, or maybe more than two, but we're keeping in mind the maintainability of the code. So how easy it is for us as a team to work on the code and maintain the code and troubleshoot the code. And then we're also keeping in mind testing. How easy is it to test our code and to make sure that we don't cause any regressions. So you'll see in a minute why this makes it really easy for me to test when I've got it pulled out this way. It's going to make it super easy for me to test it with mocking. So let's just first make sure that I didn't break anything. Let's look at test first. Now, just because test says everything is okay doesn't mean that everything's okay. So we'll check test first, because that'll kind of give me a sniff test, to see if I've broken anything. So here, remove bookmark is not defined, and that's in bookmark list. So do you know what that is? Bookmark list, remove bookmark is not defined, and then it pointed to this. That actually should be okay. Maybe I didn't save everything. That's always possible. It's like my biggest problem. Nope, that didn't fix it. Remove bookmark is not defined. Bookmark list, line 3. Did I call it the same thing here? Remove bookmark. Oh, yeah, it does. Thank you. There we go. Yes, you have to put something in front of it to define it, a const or a let. It makes sense to use const there. Okay, so that's where. So the test runs, but that still doesn't mean that it works. So let's see if it works. Now I'm actually going to end up deleting a bookmark in this case, so I'll have to add it back, but that's okay. So I've got my app running here. So it renders still, that's good. Now let's see what happens. I'm just going to put inspect on. Let's see what happens when I delete. So it deletes it from here. Let's look at console. Oh, and I can see in console the real bookmark was called. The real remove bookmark was called. So when I refresh here, yeah, it's really gone. So that's okay. That's okay. We won't panic. We won't panic. I'm prepared for this. So, so I'm just going to log in. I should have done this part before already. So I'm just going to log in to get a token so I can add my bookmark back.
Unless it falters.
Cool.
Not anymore.
My hand's frozen, so I'm having a hard time controlling my mouse. Oh shoot, I did that wrong. Hang on. Sorry about this.
Sorry.
My frozen hands.
Somebody was distracting me.
I'm just adding my Google link back. So let's just make sure I did that. Okay, so you can see that this is one good reason to use mocking. So I could do some setup in my test to like repopulate the database before test and then clean up the database after test. That's also a good practice. But if you mock your function instead, you won't have to do it in this case. Yes, Keto.
Did you have an error when you ran the test?
I had an error because I didn't define the function correctly, and I needed to put like a variable identifier.
That you did with Postman?
I just added my bookmark back because I tested that I didn't break anything, and it actually called in the real bookmark, remove bookmark, and then it actually deleted my bookmark from the database because I added that code.
Oh, no. So, is it there now? Even
It's there, so I put it back using Postman. I put my
we have to
bookmark
put it
back.
or-
Well, yeah, you just deleted it probably from.
Oh.
So, how many bookmarks do you have there? Was there only one?
The delete post. I don't think it works.
Oh, maybe it doesn't work on a server.
Yeah,
So,
it works on a
okay,
server, yeah.
all right. So if you're using your own local setup, then you can do what I just did. But if you're using Matt's, then you can't. So, okay. So I don't want to keep every time this test runs. So every time I make a code change now, what's going to happen? If I have npm test running in watch mode like I do right now.
Delete them.
Yeah, well, actually it'll delete, but what is it going to delete right now? It's actually not going to. So if I define this test, if I defined another test in bookmark test that actually tested this remove function gets called,
Yeah.
then it would, every time the test ran, it would try to delete that same bookmark. Now after the first time, actually if I used dummy data, it wouldn't find a bookmark, so it would just probably not do anything, so we'd be okay. But if you were testing with actual data, then it would delete the bookmark. And if you're end-to-end testing and clicking buttons in the browser, then it would delete, of course, but that's all right. Okay, so if we want to test without actually calling our remove, not so much because we're removing data, but probably more because we don't want the expensive call to the back end to happen, right? Then we could mock it. So let me just show you how we would mock it. It's pretty straightforward. So in the same directory as your module. So in this case, we're going to mock the remove bookmark function and bookmark service. So in the services directory, we're going to create a new file in a subdirectory called mocks, mocks, and call it bookmark service.js.
2 unders.
Yep, 2 unders before and after. Which you might hear called dunder. Dunder mocks dunder. That's PHP lingo.
Double under.
Dunder.
All I can think of when you say Dunder is Dunder, the city here.
Yeah.
That's a dirty place.
Is it?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All right. So in here, all we have to do is say const remove bookmark, so we give it the same name.
Services.
This is in services in
So you go-
the mocks. We're in here.
Oh, it's a file. Okay. Folder.
Yes.
Oh, fine. Oh, cool.
So it's going to take an ID, just like our real one. And first we'll print console.log in the mocked remove bookmark with ID and that's really all we have to do. So we just want to see that it gets called, and it gets called with the correct argument. So let's make sure I didn't miss anything.
Anyways, for a while,
And then we'll just export it. Okay, so now we'll make use of it. So we're going to add another test to our bookmark test. So we have to do 2 things if we wanted to use this mock. The first thing we have to do is say jest.mock, and we're going to tell it that we're mocking services bookmark service. Now what we're telling it is that I've created some mocks for this module, so go look for them before you run this test, and you define the functions that are called in this test. Okay? So we add that, and we're going to say let remove bookmark equal choir. Same thing, services, bookmark service. Now notice we don't refer to the mock subdirectory. We're just importing the function, okay? But because we have that mock, jest.mock, above this require, it's going to find the mocked version of the function and use that everywhere we refer to this function in this test file, okay? So, all right, so now let's add a test, and we'll say that this one should call remove bookmark and bookmark service with the correct arg, because that's what we're testing here. And we'll define our ID again, and we'll actually just steal this code here. We don't need the stub this time, okay, because we don't want it to call the stub, we want it to call the function. So we're just going to steal these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines. Now, because I'm not mocking the function, there's no way for me to check on it from this context of the test that it was called. So what I'm testing here is that I'm calling, and we have to change remove stub. What do we change it to?
So the one we want.
Or remove bookmark, right?
With that last test, did you leave off the params?
Actually, yeah.
In the anonymous function on purpose.
In the anonymous function,
Yeah,
where? What line?
33.
Oh no, it's an accident. I do it all the time too. Do it all the time, and then it fails, and I'm like, gosh, dang it. I do that, and the other thing I do is what you did the other day, Fraser, is I put a closed parenthesis here instead of a comma. I do that too all the time. I don't know why I do it, but I do it.
Did you also just copy all of the stuff out of the
I did. So what I didn't copy was I didn't copy the definition of the stub, and I didn't copy the last expect assertion, and I changed the remove function that I pass in to shallow to the actual remove bookmark from bookmark service. So there's no way for me to check from here. I started to say that the function actually got called with an expect statement because I don't have a handle on it from here. So that's why we use the mocking that we used in the last test. In this test here, we use this so we can get a handle on the function and verify it gets called. But we can't do that here. But by just running this test, we can see that an error doesn't get thrown. So we don't get a remove bookmark not found, or something like that. Or if it expects other arguments, like maybe we changed our remove bookmark and bookmark service to expect other arguments, and we didn't update our bookmark list to do that. Things like that it would test, right? It would test to make sure that from bookmark list we are passing the correct arguments to our remove bookmark and bookmark service. So if this test goes all the way through without failing, then I'll know from an automated testing perspective that this test is okay, that this test is passing. Now I added a console log, so we're actually going to be able to see, looking at the console, that it calls the mock function, but you wouldn't be using the console in automated testing. Okay? In automated testing, you want the test to run, you want them to assert positively when the test passes, and you want it to assert negatively when the test doesn't pass. But the reason that it's working okay here without an expect statement is because our negative assertion would be that something's changed that we didn't take into account on both sides, right? And so it would throw an error instead of actually going through. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Maybe I missed something along the way. But initially we tested to see if the remove stub was called.
Yeah.
Yeah? But are we essentially doing the exact same thing now? Are we not?
The difference is that when we use remove stub, we're not actually testing that what is being passed to our actual remove bookmark function is correct. What's being passed and how it's being received is correct, because we're just putting the stub in the middle and we're just calling the stub.
You're just seeing if stuff's being executed, whereas remove bookmarks, well, what we do now is we see if the right params are being passed.
That's right. That's right. So the other thing that we could do with the stub is we could add another expect here. I think it's like expect to test it how many times it's called. In some cases you may have code that you expect to be called once, but it's being called 3 times or something, you know. So we could say expect remove stub to be, I have to look it up. It's like called times or something like
I
that.
feel like it'd be easier just to if the stub could store what parameters being passed in, and we could just check to see if the parameters are right.
You can check to see. So that's one thing I checked was to be called with, right?
Yeah.
So you can check that. But you still want to make sure that when you refer to remove bookmark, like we're doing right now,
Yeah.
right, which we're pulling in from bookmark service,
Yeah.
that's what's being called.
But we've just made that now. We've just made it as a mock one.
We did, but that mock, we're not explicitly referring to that mock in the import. Did you notice that? So we're saying look for mocks, but we're actually pulling it in from bookmark service. So if it weren't defined in bookmark service correctly, then there'd be a problem.
Okay.
So we're using the mock because we've told Jest to look for mocks, and we've defined a mock for that function.
Yeah.
But we're not explicitly telling it, go use the one that I defined in mocks.
Okay.
So if we didn't have it defined in the right place, so it's not going to test everything about this function. To fully test that function, you would write a separate unit test to just test that function, right? But this is testing that when we use bookmark list, or when we use bookmark, when we refer to the bookmark component and we pass it a function, that it's calling the function that we expect it to call
Yeah.
with the right parameters. So it's, when you get into testing, there's so many things you can test, and part of the process is discerning what's really important to test. This is a little bit of a trivial case that I'm demonstrating here, just to demonstrate the concepts, how you would do it. You probably...
I think that's why I'm just trying to see the advantage of
Yep.
doing it this way.
To have been called times number. So this is a bit of a... This is a bit of a silly example.
It's nice to see how you can use the mocks though.
That's right, that's right. So I'm just using it because it's a sort of simple way to show how to do it without making it more complicated, just focusing on how you use mocks rather than something else more complex than that. I already forgot what it was. To have been called times. So we only expect it to be called once when that button is clicked once. Okay, so that's another assertion that this first type of SPY mocking is useful for, to see that your method's only called the number of times you expect it to be called. Okay, so let's see if this test runs, and that it runs the mock function and not the real function. So now when cannot find module services, bookmark service, not services. You see my typo? And now, times. Jeez. Okay. So, when we run the test, we can see that in the first test that we define, the stub's being called. In the second test, we define the mocked functions being called. Now, if I comment out these lines, or just this one, if I comment out the mock line, then you can see that the real remove bookmark got called. Okay, so
I guess that's the other part too. Is if the actual remove bookmarks dependent on some other things.
That's right. That's right. You might not want to have to worry about that. You don't want to have to test that.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the other way that it's useful. So if it's all about what are you trying to test with this test, right? And when we write an application, when we write components, there's usually some complexity. There are depths of complexity. It calls the server, which calls, this and calls that. And you don't want to necessarily test that whole line of stuff happening with this one test on the component. You just want to test that the component behaves the way you think the component should behave. And the reason that it's useful to do testing like that is because when the test fails, you know exactly what to look at. You know the problem's not on the server. You know the problem's somewhere in this component, right? Or the things that this component's directly interacting with. And that's where the problem is. That's where you have to look at your code to make a code change. So I'm going to put this back. No, it doesn't actually delete anything, of course, because 123 isn't a bookmark ID. So when you're using fake data, then we didn't have to worry about the side effect that it actually deletes the bookmark. But if you've constructed your test in a way where you've got a test database and you're using test data, you may not want it to delete your test data because maybe there are other tests that run after this that depend on that data being there. Like with everything, there's a lot of different ways to accomplish what you want to accomplish. But hopefully you can see how mocking functions in this way helps you in testing with some of these particular issues related to testing.
Can we integrate the mocking with unit tests?
You can. So say for example you want to unit test a function that calls some other functions.
Yeah.
And you don't really care about those functions operating the way that they do actually. You just want to mock that those functions return the expected value to test this higher level function, so you could use it that way. Yeah, so you can see here this has nothing to do with rendering the component necessarily. That's how I'm using it here, is rendering a button and testing that the button calls a function. But you could use jest.mock in a non-display component test, right? To just mock a function that's called by some other function in your module. Yeah. All right, so we're just going to wrap up. Is that all? Makes sense? So I'm just going to wrap up by showing you this npm test coverage. I'm going to make it regenerate the HTML. And then we're going to look at, so if you go to the coverage directory and under lcov report and you open that link to the index.html in a browser, you get this. Isn't this nice? So you get this kind of like nice HTML output for your coverage, and you can drill down on it. So even though we've added some testing, you can see overall we're not doing the best job of testing yet in this app, but our components are completely tested. We can feel good about that. And our services, so it would be easy. You can see we could add a unit test for the service that we just added, right? And you probably would be comfortable doing that, hopefully. So we could get that up pretty easily. You can drill down on each of these. So if you drill down into source, you can see what's tested under source and what's not tested.
Can you do testing on things like that?
Yeah. Yep, you can. So we talked about that a little bit the other day, that you can define unit test using describe in it. You just use the expect library of assertions instead of using assert, blah, 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 should, blah, blah, blah. You use and there's links to it in the Canvas lesson module. So if you look at expect Jest, there's a whole list of assertion methods that are available that you can use. It's a pretty rich library.
So considering these tests aren't really like TDDs, when would you actually write them? Would you sort of write a component, write a function, and then write a test for it?
Yes, yeah. So as far as when these kinds of tests are appropriate is when you feel like a component is done. Even when you feel like a component is done, you end up making changes to it later. You're like, oh, let's refactor this will be better. Or, oh, I'm going to have to use this here too, so let's make it dry and refactor and pull that out. So at the point, though, that you think your component's done, okay, you feel like, okay, coded that one's done, that's when you should write these tests. And then when you start refactoring after that point, this is going to catch regressions that you caused to your component that was done and working. And then you refactored later, it'll catch when you break your component, when you do later refactoring. So that might not be on the initial release of a product, right? It might be in the follow-up releases of the product. So these testing methods that we talked about, when we're talking about the rendering test, which are kind of the context that we looked at it in this case, the rendering tests are not test-driven development tests. They're not tests that you do up front because you're not rendering anything, or how you're rendering things change a lot until you've got your component done. But some of the things like what we just looked at with mocking functions, that could be a part of testing, unit testing. So if you're unit testing functions that call other functions, and you may want to mock those inner functions that get called. Okay, so that could be done earlier in the cycle. As soon as you've defined, that you're going to make this call to this other function, you could add a test for that. And you could use mocking. So Jest is good for testing React. It's good for testing front end because we have these things like shallow and mount. We have this function spying and all these things that make it sort of easy to test that part of front-end testing. But Jest, remember, like I talked about the other day, can also be used for unit tests instead of Mocha or Chai. You can use Jest. So if you're already using Jest, Jest is not only for React testing. It was made by React developers, so it works well with React, but it can be used for any JavaScript testing. So if you're using Jest to test your React front-end, you may as well use Jest to test the other things too, you know?
Too bad I've already set up my whole suite, like this suite.
That's right, and that's okay. So you can use this. It's fine for the purposes of the project. If you're using something else in the back end, no problem. It's not a problem. But now you know. So if you worked on something else, you might just use Jest for all of it, and you might not. But
I think we did. We used with the Jest like early on.
Mm.
Yeah, for back end testing.
Okay.